The old man still stares at me from his perch in the corner. The vestibule of his dark lenses, which leads into that forbidden realm behind the mirror dark, appear to gape and yawn like the black holes in the deepest frontiers of outer space. The gates and alleys and eternal winding labyrinths which one might find behind that set of dark lenses is enough to terrify and torture my flesh into a bumpy, cold sweat of night. Those twin portals, which appear not darker than the one which opened up upon the floorboard just moments before, are not more terrifying than the latter, if I am to be completely honest in this account. For it was the latter which ripped me from our normal sphere of understanding reality, and which chewed me up like a cud and spat me into a realm more surreal than I can even now fathom or explain in words. You see, it is my feeling in this moment that the correct words have not even been invented with which to construct an accurate description of these events. Yet I must persevere, if not out of some kind of perverse necessity or vagrant obsession, then perhaps out of duty, a duty to all of mankind, which must needs would shrink in horror away at my description of events, but which reveal realities that are all too imminent, charging towards the head of man, like a speeding bullet or an asteroid hanging above the earth. It was there, just in that corner, mere inches from the feet of that diabolical figure, that I watched her body and finally her pigtails vanish. That's right. I am writing this message to mankind at large as one who has failed. For in that moment, that shining livelong moment, I ceased to be that which I had prided myself as, that which I had magically transformed into since the moment of her birth. From some wreck, some travesty of a human being, I had transformed into a thoughtful and intransigent guardian, a protector, a dragon that surrounded the most precious of gems, one who guarded the most precious of angels, one of the rarest commodities across the globe, that loving baby girl who vanished into the hole. But now, this had ended in a most unbelievable and inglorious fashion, and I have again devolved into that wreck, that travesty of a human being which I alluded to. Let me tell you this one thing, which I must say now before I can explain further, so that I may leave no man who peruses this document with any doubts whatsoever on the matter. That is, I will have my revenge. No, I won't go softly into the night in an attempt to forget what I have seen, perhaps to pretend that she never existed at all, maybe just check myself into a mental hospital and let the meds take their course as I slowly descend into an amnesic state, where pain, fear, love cease to exist. Think it not, hypothesize it not, let not the least germ of the suggestion plant itself in your thoughts. I am a man with no cowardice, with nothing to lose and with everything, even death, to gain. It had been a day like any other. Only perhaps it hadn't been, as humans are indeed infinitely limited in the scope of our perceptions, and there is much which remains caught in our filter. Of this I am now more convinced than ever, and what may evolve behind the curtains of our sphere we cannot see, we cannot hear, we cannot smell. Just before it happened, I had newly arrived home from my occupation. As I walked up the drive and took to the steps, the nanny had simultaneously blown out the door and strode past me in a hurry, without acknowledging me in the slightest. A most strange occurrence. I looked after her for a moment in a blinking manner as her car sped down the road. I remember only thinking that she must have been late for some very important date. Her typical way of doing things was to wait inside with my daughter until I'd arrived, gone in, taken my coat and shoes off, and settled in a bit. She often spoke of niceties during this time, However, such things we often view as innocuous anomalies, things which must have a rational explanation, and therefore must be no cause for alarm. I couldn't have been more mistaken. After she'd vanished from view, I paused on the sidewalk and stared up at my suburban Cape Cod home, white with blue trim with an attached garage. I worked as a CPA for one of the big four firms, and so this was a modest home for my means. It was the starter home for my wife and I. We'd bought it a year after getting married. It was located a bit north of the Jersey Shore, and therefore I'd suffered through a 2-hour commute into the city. But as a young man starting a family, it hadn't hurt too much. From the beginning, I'd promised my wife that this was not our forever home. Not that there was anything wrong with it, but we'd bought it from the estate of an elderly man with very little means who'd barely updated the place in decades. We'd done enough minor renovations to update it to a livable condition, but there was yet something highly underwhelming about it still. In addition to that, despite the fact that I was still young, that sort of commute could work wondrous hell on anyone's joints. I'd promised myself that eventually I'd be the type of man to buy a truly impressive home for my family. I'd gotten the big promotion to partner a couple years ago, but I just hadn't been able to see my way to selling that house. You see, my wife had passed away during childbirth, but this is something I rarely speak of. I bring it up only to point out my inability to part with this house, as if something had been left unsettled between it and I. As I walked in, I threw the newspaper I had collected off the sidewalk onto the table, put a pot of coffee on, another ritual the nanny had typically taken care of for me prior to my arrival, and sat down at the kitchen table to remove my shoes. Due to the unusual circumstances to which I had come home, it hadn't exactly dawned on me to check on my daughter right away. As the notion struck me, I told myself that she must be safely playing inside of her gated play area, and this must be the reason the nanny had felt privileged to leave a little early and in such a hurried manner. As with all such palliative measures to our worst anxieties, I still felt compelled to go check on her right away, despite the fact that I knew everything was okay. As already alluded to, this was the exact moment that I stood up and walked into the living room to observe the most psychologically shattering thing I have ever experienced, even to this very day. After I had finished screaming at the top of my lungs, I tried to plead with this man, or perhaps even to reason with him. Who the hell are you? Where is she? Where did my daughter go? What is this? I pointed to the hole in the floor near his feet in a demanding manner, my fist clenched threateningly. But the old man didn't budge. It was as if he hadn't even been there, with me gesticulating madly in front of him, yelling into his face. I couldn't make out his eyes behind the dark shades he wore that were impenetrably screening. Sir, if you don't answer me, I'll be forced to dial the police this instant. I made this threat somehow knowing that it was false, that it wouldn't ring true, that it would never happen. I next even crossed the room and picked up my cell phone, pretending to dial, pretending to raise it to my ear, pretending to speak to some imaginary responder about this old fiend, this kidnapper who had broken into my home, had stolen my daughter, had hidden her away, and now refused to speak or to divulge any further information to me. However, as I eyed his unmoving frame in that chair, as I noticed his very corpse-like disposition, the act lost all of its heart and faded as I let my arm drop and set the phone down again. I now approached the man cautiously, studying him carefully, taking in every detail of his dress and bearing. I must know him somehow from the past. There must be some relevance to his presence here. It couldn't be just random, could it? Was it possible that such rare events occasionally occurred, seemingly out of the blue like a metastasis? I remember hearing long ago that according to the quantum theory of matter, that if one banged one's head against the wall a sufficient number of times, and we are talking numbers with many zeros, that eventually there was some probability of the atoms lining up sufficiently that one's head would simply pass right through the wall, as if it were nothing more tangible than the vacuum. Was this one such random event, born of the partition function of all possible occurrences in the universe simply collapsing in space and time with this particular arrangement of atoms in my little Cape Cod home here in the burbs? Or perhaps, drawing on Occam's razor, I had simply lost my mind. Yes, gone completely batshit crazy. Although they say if I was truly crazy, I wouldn't entertain the possibility of insanity, and therefore it must be ruled out, no? No, something else was going on here, something deeper, something more insidious, but I lacked the words to describe anything approaching a rational description. In fact, the only apt manner in which I could describe it, I had already utilized, that is, screaming at the top of my lungs. This was a tool I made use of again, as the old man refused to even flinch after I passed my hand several times in front of his face, and even faked him out with a punch that stopped just an inch short of his nose. Although, to be precise, to use the terminology faked him out, he would have had to have noticed that I was there. After this, I made my decision. I was losing precious time on this investigation into the old man's presence here in my home. Precious minutes and now hours were melting away in which my daughter had been taken by something beyond my comprehension, something seemingly unknowable. Acknowledging this, that any further investigation would prove fruitless, there was only one thing left to do. That was to swallow my cowardice and to take that same leap of faith that my daughter had seemingly done but an hour ago. I was going to step into that hole, that portal, come what may, and bring my daughter back home. My thoughts turned towards my late wife as I made this resolution. She had died to give our daughter life, to bring her into this world, and now I was on the verge of losing her. I took a deep breath as I stepped up to that simple black hole that looked like something out of a cartoon. I looked at the old man one last time. You sick old bastard. See you in hell, if that's where this leads. I closed my eyes as I stepped onto that hole. I had expected to feel myself free-falling, as if the elevator cables had just snapped. Perhaps for only a short time before hitting the ground, or perhaps it would be something that never ended, as if I'd stepped into a bottomless pit. But nothing of the sort happened. When I opened my eyes, I found myself still standing on the floor in the same position as previously, but my surroundings had decidedly changed. Let me explain. As I looked around, I stood in what appeared to be the same room as before, but now somehow different. I mean, structurally, architecturally speaking, identical, but decorated completely differently. All of the modern furnishings had vanished. The sheetrocked walls had been covered over with that faux wood paneling. The hi-hat lights and ceiling fan were gone. Instead, faux lamps jutted out from the wall, emitting orange incandescent glow. The vinyl tiles of the floor had been replaced with thick furry carpet like a shag rug with mixed brownish hues. The furniture is what stood out most and brought me to the realization of what this was. The television set was an old tube with an antenna sticking out the top. The couch, the chairs were all mid-century stuff, the European-influenced mass-market stuff. I realized that it was still my house, just circa the late 1950s or early 1960s. I had no idea of what exactly was going on, or what year this decor was from, or how I had come to be here. But these ruminations quickly became the furthest thing from my mind, as I quickly called out my daughter's name as loudly as I could. There was only deadly quietude in response. as if the room in which I stood was actually buried miles beneath the earth's crust. I turned suddenly, expecting to see that old man still behind me. However, there was none. In that moment, every fiber of my being was screaming to fling myself into this and begin frantically searching the place for my daughter. The surrealism of this new environment, however, appeared to give me pause. The hesitation I felt was most morbid at this time. After what had occurred thus far today over the space of the last hour or two, I had the dreadful feeling that literally anything might happen next. It seemed logical to me in this moment that a seemingly banal object such as a book lying on the coffee table might in the next instant fly at my face with bindings spread to display rows of razor-sharp fangs, whereupon it would indulge in biting my lips off. Just an afternoon lip sandwich with tea and crumpets, as it were, for this fine work of literature. Therefore, I tiptoed forward in what could be described as an overly cautious manner for a man whose adrenaline in terms of moles per liter was surely off the charts. After a cursory search of the living room, where I made sure to look behind any object where a small human might be able to fit, I had come up with nothing. Everything I touched was seemingly solid, apparently normal. I couldn't rule out that the objects might be emitting some kind of alien radiation that would bring me to my knees with melted organs at any minute. But aside from that, it was shaping up to be a grand old time. When I exited the living room and came up to the foyer, where the staircase typically led up to the second story of the house, I was amazed to see that the staircase now terminated where it met the ceiling of the first story. The interface between the two was smooth, as if it had been built this way by design, that the landing should abut right up against the ceiling, a staircase to nowhere. As I turned, it was revealed to me that the door to the outside world was likewise missing in action, and that one of those wood panels was inconsiderately covering the exact location where it should have been. A foreboding feeling began to build in my chest as I had an inkling of the only place I'd likely find an open egress to. You guessed it, the basement. Even during the best of times, I'd hated going down into the basement of that house. It was one of those low-ceiling basements where I had to bend my neck slightly to walk about, and therefore there had been little question of ever getting it finished. The furnace and oil tank dominated much of the real estate. However, there was a narrow crawl space that led into another portion of the basement which opened up beyond the main foundation of the new addition into the original basement of the house, the stones that had been laid there in the 1800s. There was no longer access to this original basement of the house except for that crawl space which, in essence, was too narrow for me to fit through, and as such I'd never even seen the other side of the wall that separated the modern and the older foundation. As I entered into the kitchen, another marvel now awaited me, where formerly the open concept of the kitchen with the extended island which opened up into the grand dining room with a fireplace which it turned opened up orthogonally to a den which was the entryway to my study and to the basement. Now I found a small cramped kitchen with a dining table that abutted the counter, which housed a small stove, a sink parallel to a refrigerator, nothing else. Behind the dining table was the sole door that the kitchen featured, and my only path of egress from this place to which I had been transported. My worst fears were confirmed as I acknowledged that it must have been the door to the original basement of the house, and that was where I was headed for next. As I opened that portal into the basement, I could see nothing. The lighting in the kitchen had been low, sure, but I expected even a dim halo of light to illuminate perhaps the landing of the staircase. But this was not what I experienced. Instead, at the threshold of the doorframe, the light appeared to cease all existence, as if beyond that doorframe was a black hole that swallowed the light ravenously. After a period of inquisitive wonder at this spectacle, it dawned on me that what I now looked at was simply another manifestation of what had brought me here to begin with. It was another of those holes. As a CPA, I was used to dealing with numbers. I was quite soothed by the logical practice of debits, credits, multipliers, and exponents. This logical profession, where everything always adds up to the sum or the deficit, where everything is accounted for, had given me the outlook of a rational man of our times, a typical man of our times, where to me, science had been a complete system, much akin to accounting, where atoms and their motions were simply added up. During collisions of atoms, energy was added to one side, and equal measure subtracted from the other. This bean-counting exercise led to some interesting economies of scale that gave us the picture of the world we inhabit of solid objects acting in logical ways under Newtonian forces that never deviated from their causal courses. I had been led into a materialist and atheistic view of the universe, not only by the personal tragedies which I had suffered under, but this unassailable outlook whereby mass and energy were conserved and all must follow the laws of non-contradiction and causality. Therefore, with what I had been subjected to on this day, thus far, it made me regret deeply that I'd never been much of a metaphysician. I couldn't fit these occurrences into the neat little box of my worldview, but I knew that there must be some way of explaining this rationally and mathematically. If true randomness, such as I was being subjected to now, did actually exist, but only in extremely low probabilities, then I single myself out as the unluckiest man of our times. Otherwise, I'd need to start questioning these entrenched preconceptions of mine to make what was currently arbitrary and absurd quite sensical again. Little did I know that such reveries as I was then making were soon to dissipate from my consciousness, like the vaporous smoke rings that they were. True knowledge always comes at a terrible price. If there is one thing I am now certain of, it is that. The one piece of advice I can give is never rest on these type of suppositions. Never argue when you know not what of. Never believe that you understand even the smallest fragment of that which we call our existence. That way, when you're next up to the plate for such excursions as I have lived through, it won't come as such a shock to the system, like plunging the ego into a vat of ice water. As I found myself stepping across the threshold of that basement door, this time, the anxiety was not so poignant. Last time there had been little fanfare, and I suppose I'd already developed some prejudices regarding these things that kept popping up. This was a mistake. As David Hume had pointed out centuries ago, nothing more than habit assures you that the sun will rise the next day. It's a mere prejudice. I think that most people are still missing the true thrust of this one essential truth which he uncovered. That perhaps, just as an organism is a creature of habit that can deviate often in its regular patterns of behavior, so too might be the universe itself. This time, I did find myself accelerating at an unbelievable rate. I could feel my organs gradually being pressed against my ribcage. I could feel the blood pooling into my limbs. As I began to spin at such an unbelievable rate of rotation, it felt as if my arms would be pulled from their sockets by the incredible G-forces. But before any permanent harm or disfiguration could result, I found myself laying on a hard surface, completely discombobulated. When the world had finally stopped spinning and the nausea subsided sufficiently, I was able to sit up, as it were, and observe my surroundings. I found myself again sitting on the floor of the living room, only now things had again further transmogrified, further gone astray. I now sat in what looked like a turn-of-the-century room. The faux wooden panels on the walls had been replaced by actual planking. Likewise, I sat upon some kind of hand-woven rug which lay over the floor planks. The incandescent bulbs had been replaced by actual kerosene lanterns which jutted from the walls. There was an actual hearth where a fire was burning currently. The furniture, all seemingly handmade of oak, the pillows made of feather. As far as I could fathom, it appeared that I made my way back to the original state of that house, given the decor, granting the limitations of my ability to date it accurately, as a CPA with no formal training in such a niche area of historical knowledge. As I struggled to my feet, still hyperventilating with the stress of the journey here, perspiration pouring down my face, I nearly collapsed with exhaustion as I used every fiber in my being to scream out my daughter's name. "Where are you, honey? Come to daddy, sweetie." My cries again rang out unanswered except by my own echo, as if the silence in this domain had become even more stifling than the last. The empty silence one might expect of an underground missile silo or some such thing. Once more I began my search through this rustic domicile, verily turning the place over in my frustration as I searched in vain for any sign of my darling child, who I was beginning to fear the worst for. How hellish, and I mean the word hellish, was this experience? Why me? I couldn't stop asking myself. What had I done to deserve this? My train of thought waxed philosophical as I pondered the choices I'd made in my life, as slowly, step by step, began to question everything I'd ever believed in or held sacred, just as I was on the verge of losing all hope, and perhaps breaking completely with the reality in front of my eyes as I descended into some permanent, comatose state. The one thing that could possibly be my salvation happened. I found Dolly. Dolly was my daughter's favorite doll, a stuffed rag doll, so to speak, with the innocent face of an angel. Throughout her earliest years, I had tucked my daughter into bed each night, making sure she had Dolly under her arm. Dolly was her oldest boon companion, so to speak. So here, now, seeing this, it was a sign that I was on the right track. But the implications swarmed in my mind. My daughter was here, in this strange and desolate place, alone, and she had the courage to go forward, to enter into these vacuous black holes, to keep spiraling further downward into this abyss of the underworld. And now, she had left her dearest stuffed companion behind? What could possibly be the meaning of this? This clue served to bias my opinion in the direction that perhaps my daughter was not alone. After all, I hadn't witnessed the entire affair of her disappearance down that hole. As I thought back, I recalled the babysitter running out of the house as if she'd just seen Satan himself appear before her eyes in a ring of fire. Something must have happened prior to my arrival. Something which had led to that old scarecrow of a man sitting in the corner with a hole in the floor near his feet, and my daughter vanishing just as I rounded that corner. It struck me that my daughter might have purposely left Dolly here, in this domain, knowing that I would come to find her. Clever girl, I thought to myself, clever girl. As genuine tears born of an aching heart came to my eyes for the first time since I'd been down here in this dungeon prison, I was forced to steel myself against these nascent emotions as I realized that each moment spent in such reverie was another lost in which I should have been closing in on the culprit who had taken my daughter in through this portal. With my spirits now revived and resurrected by this indirect sign of my daughter, as of an item that was dear to her and that she had been holding just hours before, I moved forward into the foyer. The steps were now not in existence, the second floor apparently having been added sometime after this point in time. The kitchen was now reduced to the bare rudiments, a cast iron wood stove with a grill over the top of it, some dark pine cabinets that looked as if they'd been cured with charring, and an oak table with some simple tools surrounding it. Without wasting time, I again turned towards the cellar door and pulled it open. This time, however, I could see within a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. There was a kerosene lamp burning on the kitchen table. I grabbed it and descended the creaky and crookedly set basement stairs until I hit the dirt beneath of the original basement of the house. To my astonishment, the basement was completely empty, other than a pair of iron doors set into the floor with the Greek symbol engraved across the opening. Despite my lack of knowledge and learning of the Greek alphabet, I did recognize it. It was the symbol Omega. These doors opened up much like Bilko-style doors, except that they were exactly flush with the basement floor. There was a simple bolt drawn across, which locked the doors from my side. It was difficult for me to imagine my daughter having gone in there and simultaneously having been able to close and bolt these doors behind her. However, here I was staring at the only possible point of egress. I hadn't done much research on who the original occupants and owners of this house were that had built it over a century ago. I remember the realtor telling us that the land in question, which had since been divided into several neighboring plots, one of which we had bought, originally belonged to a family of Dutch settlers in New Jersey. The original structures from the 1700s had been destroyed in a massive fire at one point, whereupon the new house, the one which served as the substrate for our current home, the one in which I currently stood in the basement of, had been built at the turn of the century. It occurred to me these doors could lead to nothing other than a shallow root cellar as deep as I am tall, or that perhaps the house had been built over some kind of a cistern, or what's more, a well that served as a water source for the previous settlement before the fire. The depth of such a well was certainly beyond my reckoning, and the drilling capabilities of the early 18th century settlers of the Americas was a subject far remote from my areas of expertise. As I undid the bolt and pulled the doors open, there was a horrible screeching sound as each part of the door hinges ground against each other ancient rusted part. I had now found the next hole, the next portal into the great beyond I knew not what of. That is, no matter how close I held that kerosene lamp to the open entrance into this supposed well, it illumined nothing, which meant nothing was there to illuminate, not even the earth's crust. I imagined that beyond this threshold, I would finally be reunited with my poor daughter, my lovely daughter, the best little girl I'd ever known. I simply stepped into this void. This time my transition was seamless, where before it felt as if I traversed something in between the two worlds I experienced. This time I was instantly someplace else. This time it was not a recognizable variation of my home, warped by the passage backward in time. Instead, the transition had occurred in space. I felt truly in that space beneath those iron doors, that is, wherever they led to, was where I now stood. This was of course only an intuition, one that could never be verified, but yet it was a feeling that emanated strongly even down to my bones. I now found myself standing in what looked like a dungeon pathway in some medieval castle. The stone floor and walls were damp with condensation. The stone ceiling was an elevated arch well above my head, and a single torch burned on the wall to my right, illuminating the scene. All was quiet, other than the occasional pitter-patter of condensation droplets falling into small pools of water on the floor. I quickly stuffed Dolly as far as was possible into my pocket and grabbed the flaming torch from the wall. The heat of the torch was much welcomed in this cold, damp, underground vault. I looked behind me and then in front of me, finding only darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Without any internal or external compass to guide me, I simply began moving forward. Each step I took resulted in a horrifying echo through the stone masonry, which filled my ears and caused a shiver to run down my spine. I didn't dare shout my daughter's name down here, not being able to see anything of what awaited at the end of the tunnel, not yet, anyway. As I continued, formless monsters took shape in the darkness, the penumbra beyond the halo of my torch causing me to hesitate with each aching step. Eventually, the lantern revealed an entryway off the main tunnel off to my left. There was no door to this entryway that opened up into a long room. As I leaned into the room, extending my arm with the torch, I recognized the nature of this room immediately. There were rows of rectangular stone structures along each wall, each with engravings on the end. There were many statues and small idols which stood atop the stone structures, many of whose nature I could not understand from my vantage point in the darkness with my flickering light source. However, some definitely smacked of having a distinctly alchemical, or perhaps, dare I say, a demonic character. In the least, it was all definitely very pagan. It was evident that I was standing in a tomb. My mind spun with possibilities. The story from the realtor again surged into my mind's eye. I imagined the several structures on the farm ablaze in the middle of the night. I heard the screams of mothers for their children, of wives for their husbands, as chaos and destruction ensued in every direction. I envisioned the smoking, burnt husks that the survivors must have had to wait days to enter into to collect their dead. It was possible that in this isolated region, the settlers had turned their backs on God after this terrible tragedy. Perhaps they had sought protection someplace else, which would explain the cryptic statues of creatures with surging musculature, horns at all angles, and long, extended jaws. How could one explain these lengths to which those people had been driven? To sell one's own soul. I imagined leaving the only world that one had known, the old world, on a perilous journey with nothing but the promise of the freedom to worship your God as you saw fit in the new world. To have survived this journey over the Atlantic by the skin of one's teeth, to have fought against an unwelcoming and harsh wilderness year after year, to pioneer and to build something new, only to have it all taken away in the space of a few hours, and from what it comes down to, a single spark. Something lasting only a few milliseconds that lit your whole world on fire. I shuddered as I quickly moved away from that room, feeling instinctively that my torch was unwelcome there in that space. As I continued through the tunnels, there were many other such rooms that looked to have once served as food or wine storage or something else. It was a veritable underground labyrinth which I had entered into. I turned down one corridor after the next until I'd lost count and my original starting point had become untraceable. As I continued to walk with what I imagined every boogeyman known to humanity lurking in my mind, jumping out at me around every corner, it eventually so happened that the growing tension had gotten the best of me. My nerves had worn thin, and I could no longer hold it in. I finally let it out, finally blew as I began sprinting forward into the darkness and screaming my daughter's name at the top of my lungs. I ran until my lungs were on fire and my legs felt like overstretched rubber bands that might give out at any moment. I screamed until my voice was hoarse and nearly unusable. Just as I passed another room that branched off the main hallway, I stopped so quickly that I nearly tumbled forward head over heels. I stood stark still, listening. I heard something. The first something other than my own footsteps I had heard since I entered into this dimension. Daddy! So innocent, so unmistakable in form was the voice which rang out from within that room. Sweetheart! I shouted as I sprinted into that room. There she was, laying on a nearly disintegrated straw bed with a pile of rags to cover her from the cold. I held the torch away and immediately ran to embrace her, lifting her up in my arms. "I love you, Daddy," she said as she tenderly kissed my cheek in the most nonchalant manner, as if I were merely just picking her up from daycare. In that instant, I moaned as I grabbed my chest. "Are you okay, Daddy? You look weird." "It's okay, honey. Daddy's just got a little case of heartburn." It was the understatement of the year. In reality, I feared I might be having a minor heart attack, not because I was unhealthy, but from the extremity of duress that I'd been put through over the past few hours, which was perhaps, if not the most extreme, life-changing terror I'd ever felt, certainly a close runner-up. I held my daughter at arm's reach as I collected myself. "Now, listen to me, honey." "Daddy, you found Dolly." She cut me off as her wandering eyes lighted on my pocket. She gingerly plucked Dolly from me and hugged the doll tightly to her chest. "I knew you would find her, Daddy. That's why I left her for you. In case you got scared, you could hug Dolly, just like I always do." "Thank you, sweetheart. Such a thoughtful girl you are. But you need to understand this is very important, to listen to your father right now and answer me as faithfully as you can. Why did you go down into that hole? Who brought you here?" She stared at me for a few moments as if she were completely confused as to what I was referring to and needed to contemplate the answer. "Who took you here, sweetie?" I repeated as tenderly as I could with the mounting pain in my chest and my growing impatience. Though she made as if she would answer me directly, within the next second such an answer became the most irrelevant thing in the world for both of us. A terrible shrieking sound, ear-piercing in the intensity, demonic sounding, and filled with malicious hatred, filled the entire space of the tunnel. It was accompanied by a thunderous sound of approaching footsteps. I picked my daughter up. In that moment, she seemed unimpressed by the horror of what approached. I presumed in a state of shock. I emerged from the room into an intersection where 3 tunnels met. I couldn't tell which direction the shrieks were coming due to the intense echoing effect in this dungeon. And so I chose a direction and just ran with all my might. It was only as I drew closer to those terrible shrieks that I understood that I had chosen terribly and irreversibly the wrong direction. My torch illuminated 2 pairs of hands on the stone floor facing me, and as I clawed forward, I saw 2 naked feet which faced away. It was as if the owner of these limbs were walking in crab-like style towards me, with their belly facing the ceiling. However, this interpretation turned out to be shockingly wrong. As the creature emerged into the full illumination of my torch, I witnessed a centaur-like creature which bore no features of the horse, but was a human body somehow twisted into such a configuration. The legs were facing away from its forward movement, much like the crab walk I had alluded to, but at the waist the creature was twisted in such a fashion that the upper torso faced forward at the same time. The creature's arms were elongated to such an extent and twisted in the exact opposite direction, such as they served as forelimbs for the creature to move on all fours, in the identical fashion to a child's crab walk. The large breasts I saw were the only indication that this creature was female, because, as I said, the groin faced away from me, in the posterior direction. The face of the creature, however, was the most distorted, cruel, and angular concoction that Mother Nature had ever devised to torture the mind of man. High, robust cheekbones with a bony and knobby forehead, hardly any nose there at all, a most unnaturally angular chin, and as I observed when it opened its mouth once more to let out another ear-piercing shriek, The orifice opened up all the way to the ears, revealing several rows of razor-sharp teeth, this all emerging with pale, grim skin that looked as if it had never seen the light of day, under the mop of tangled, long, and matted dark hair that looked like the hairpiece of Medusa herself. I squared myself up to the monstrosity that lurked in front of me as I set my daughter down by my side and simply bade her, "Run. Run and don't look back. I'll be right behind you." But my daughter did no such thing. In fact, she stood smiling up at me as the creature let out another horrendous roar of bloodlust. "Don't be silly, Daddy. It's Mommy. Mommy brought me here. Mommy wanted to see you especially." I looked down at my daughter in horror and pity, though every fiber of my being was telling me I needed to get her to go while I distracted this freak of nature. I couldn't bring myself to yell at her. Not now. Not ever. "Sweetheart," I managed to choke out, "that is not your mother. We talked about this before. Mommy is gone. You never knew your mother. She's the woman in those pictures I used to show you. Your mother loved you very much, but she died giving birth to you. We can't see her again." At that, the creature let out a low, threatening groan, as if it had been wounded somehow. "Don't worry, Mommy, he doesn't see yet. I can tell him it's you. It's really you." She grabbed my hand and looked directly up at me. "Mommy told me all about how you two met. Mommy was head over heels in love," she said. "She was reading a book at a library at the university. You were sitting at a table across from her. She said she noticed you staring, but when she tried to stare back, you looked away real fast like. Silly Daddy. She also told me how she really died." As I stared into the creature's black, demonic eyes, I felt as if the world was rushing past me. It was true. My wife hadn't died in childbirth, even though I said so reflexively at the beginning of this document. I swear to you I didn't mean to lie. I was just so used to feeding that story to my colleagues, to distant family members I hadn't seen in years, or to the string of women I attempted to meet at bars or online and failed to do so since my wife's death. Yes, it was all a lie, but a lie so often repeated that it appeared I'd started to believe it myself. I'd started to forget the reality of what really happened, and that feeling of numbness that came with forgetting, well, it turned out to be so seductive that it had become a full-blown addiction. As I stood in that underground tunnel, the realities of the past began to swarm my mind's eye. It all began playing back to me, rushing up from my unconscious as if I were watching a movie in a dark theater. My wife and I had gotten into a contract on that house the month we found out she was pregnant with our daughter. My wife had had dreams of pursuing a career in high finance in the city, but it was all put on hold when we learned of her condition. It turned out that her pregnancy was high risk. I won't go into the details, but she was strictly prescribed a routine of bed rest and taking it easy around the house for the next 6 months. From the moment we moved into that house, I could sense a change in my wife. I could never truly put my finger concretely down on the cause of that change. There was the terrible morning sickness that seemed to last all day, every day. The poor thing could barely keep anything down, and meanwhile myself, the fool that I was, the young fool going into this fatherhood thing for the first time, kept giving her a hard time about it, making her feel guilty, goading her, as if she were purposely starving the child that grew inside of her. Looking back, I made so many mistakes, not realizing how high the stakes can be when it comes to such things. All I can say is that you never know, and I don't care who you're dealing with, you just never know. You can never glean a look inside the mind of another the psychological portrait with all its weathering, its faded spots, its cracks, its stains, and its wrinkles. And so we struggled along, me often spending time away from the office to take care of the extra house duties and to attempt to play nurse to my wife, who seemed to be growing resentful of my, how did she call it, my Mr. Perfect attitude. A few weeks prior to the full term of the pregnancy, we had both woken up in the middle of the night to bed sheets thoroughly drenched in blood. My wife was rushed to the hospital and an emergency C-section was performed. This was the key to the fable that I had invented. It was true that my wife had almost, so to speak, died during childbirth. The reality of it was that she survived, even by a thick margin. It was the events which occurred after this, which had actually, eventually, led to her early death. From the moment we brought the baby home, things took a turn for the worst. I tell you, from the moment we crossed the threshold and I set the baby in the crib for the first time, the digs, the barely veiled insults, the denigration of my entire being and capabilities and history as a man set in. You see, I had set the baby down incorrectly. After that, I had bottle-fed the baby entirely wrong. It was the diaper changing next, and so on, but through all of this psychological battery, my wife refused to touch our daughter, to raise a finger for anything regarding her care, and worst of all, she never even held her for a single second. I just couldn't wrap my mind around this behavior. My wife had completely transformed from the woman I once knew, the woman that I had married, who had danced like a wild child and drank too much wine at our wedding. Now, unrecognizable. Now I lay in bed. That is, only on the rare occasions that she would come to bed, preferring to sleep alone on the couch away from the baby's crib, near a morose and frigid woman who refused even to acknowledge the presence of me or my daughter or show even the slightest interest in our existence. Needless to say, after my paternity leave ended and I was forced back to the office, I had to hire a nanny right away, despite the fact that my income was then quite meager in comparison to today. In fact, I only once or twice saw her become animated about the baby. On these occasions, I had come home to find my wife, who had sent the nanny home early in one of her fits of rage, standing over the rail of the crib staring at our daughter. When I walked in and placed my hand on her shoulder, thinking that some breakthrough must have finally occurred, that I was getting my wife, the person I so loved with all my heart and soul, the person dearest to me in this world, back, with tears nearly pouring from my eyes, I was seriously disturbed when she turned suddenly and slapped my hand away with a look of disgust at the sight of me. I watched her lower lip tremble, not in pain, but in utmost anger and fear. "There is something wrong with the child," she whispered in an intense manner, as if afraid of being overheard by whom I knew not, as we were alone in the house at this time. "What? What could you possibly mean? She looks happy as a clam. What's the meaning of—" She cut me off with a cold and threatening glare. "She keeps looking at things which aren't there. She keeps laughing and cooing, as if someone were playing with her, as if someone were engaging her. But no one is there. No one. I've been watching her. Something's not right." I stared at my wife with a heart which continually sunk lower into my stomach. "No, dear. She's a baby. What do you expect? You should be the one engaging her. You should be trying to play with her. Maybe then she wouldn't have to act like that. She needs stimulation from somewhere, and if you don't give it to them, they'll find a way to imagine it for themselves. It's very basic. It's—" "No." She placed her hands on my chest, pushing me away hard. "You're not listening. There is something wrong with this house. There is something wrong with the baby. It's all your fault," She began walking towards me with a murderous glare. I hate you more than anything I've ever hated in my whole life. You worthless excuse of a man. You brought us to this hellhole, this portal to Hell's Gate. You brought that child into a corrupted and disgusting, filthy hellhole. And now, something is wrong with it, and you expect me to fix it? Of course, big man over there. You lazy, petrified piece of worthless flesh. I hate you. Dear, please, I tried to reason. I hope you and that thing, she said, pointing to the crib, die, as she rushed past me with a final look of utmost hatred. Of course, I was able to brush this off. In the months that followed, I watched as she descended further into what I called at the time merely her mental illness. I watched as she gradually became mute, refusing to speak at all to me or to the nanny, refusing to leave the house, and eventually refusing to leave the bedroom or even to let me in when I entreated entry. All I could think of was myself. What had I done to deserve this? I know that her true passion in life was for painting, that ever since she was a little girl she'd wanted to become an artist. Her parents had pushed her into a more practical direction, to put it lightly. In reality, they had had some kind of mania about their daughter becoming a high-powered executive in the world of finance, and you could only imagine what that sort of childhood was like. It was a dream that was forced onto her, but which she never truly shared. And I, in my own world of rationality and practicality, mirrored her parents' ambitions for her, realizing that 2 large incomes would mean an easier life, less weight on my shoulders, not having to carry a starving artist and a child, private preschools for our daughter, and so on. I did push her to put away her childish things and, so to speak, to man up. Perhaps she was punishing me for this, that I had not supported her dreams sufficiently, that I'd laid a trap for her with no way out, that she was now a mother who was being pushed to go back into the workforce and who claimed that she couldn't paint anymore, that she'd lost the spark and talent for it long ago. But these are just wandering thoughts. In reality, I never sat down and really asked her these things. I never demanded to know her heart, or else, with a gun to my head. And thus, what happened eventually happened. The day of her death had started out like any other. I hadn't heard from or seen my wife as I got ready for work in the morning. As soon as the nanny had come in, I was out the door, off to face the workday, and I didn't spare another moment's thought for my domestic troubles. I worked like a maniac. I worked to forget. And for that reason, things were going well professionally, while in reality, my entire world was falling apart. When I arrived home, I noticed the nanny's car was missing. My wife must have sent her home early, I thought, as I paused, ruminating on the sidewalk before I picked up the paper and went in. As usual, I put on some coffee and sat down at the kitchen table as I opened up the paper to the finance section. Before I had read long, and before I could get a sip of that coffee whose aroma now filled the kitchen, I heard something that gave me pause. I strained my ears to hear it, nonchalantly at first. It was the sound of running water, as if a bath was being drawn. I can't be sure exactly why, but something wasn't adding up for me. I stood up and went hesitatingly to see whether my wife was doing any better than usual today. I turned the handle to the bedroom door, and to my surprise it opened freely. I looked in and saw that the bathroom door was slightly ajar, and steam was pouring out of the crack in the door. I didn't want to startle her or cause her to fly into one of her rages, so I called out as a prelim to my approach, "Honey, I'm home. Just wanted to make sure you're all right. Let's talk when you're done with that bath." And with that, I turned and walked down the hall towards the nursery, which had been the home to the baby's crib for some time, since she was more than a few months old and no longer needed to be kept by the bedside. But when I had entered into the nursery and gazed over the side of the crib, I found it empty. Alarm bells and sirens started going off in my head without being able to put an actual form to what they bespoke of. In a state more of puzzlement than anything else, I returned to our bedroom, but barged straight into the bathroom this time. There I saw the warm water running into the bath, my wife standing by the side of the tub, her hands submerged, and the tiny legs and arms of our daughter kicking for dear life. I felt the world spinning around me before the adrenaline surged and hit me square in the solar plexus as I heard my wife shout, "This has to end. This has to end now, before it's too late." "What are you doing, you insane whore?" I screamed as I crossed the bathroom and in an instant had pulled my daughter out from the surface of that water and sent my wife spiraling against the wall with an elbow to her chin where she folded into a crumpled up pile. "You effing bitch! You evil witch! You piece of garbage, you!" My voice dropped off as my daughter continued to cough up water as I clapped the middle of her back over and over again. Once she had settled down, I rushed her over to the bed and began dressing her and making sure that she was otherwise unharmed. It seemed that everything else was okay. I then rushed her over to the nursery and laid her in the crib, turning on her favorite TV show to calm her down, whereupon I locked the nursery door and shut it behind me. It was the kind of lock that required a tiny screwdriver to open from the outside, and I was the only holder of such a tool in the house, which I kept hidden away. I returned to the bedroom with my cell phone in hand. "That's it. I'm calling the police," I shouted preemptively as I entered the room, expecting to find her apologetic and in tears. However, when I entered the bathroom, no one was there. I quickly ran back out and checked the hallway, finding the nursery door still firmly shut with no one there. I ran down the stairs shouting, "How could you do this? You're a murderer, you're a madman, a maniac. You should be locked up." I didn't find her in the living room or the kitchen nor the den. I saw that the door to my study was open and peeked my head inside as I said, "Did you hear me? I'm calling the police. Your act is up. You're done for. Your time making this household a living hell is over with." That was when I knew I'd find her in tears, ready to submit herself to the doctors and the psychologists that she had so resisted thus far, ready to give our love a second chance, ready to get back to work, ready to finally become a family the way that we had always meant to be. I was again smacked down with the sight of an empty room. I noticed that she had been in there. The papers on top of my desk were strewn about. The drawer stood open as if she'd been looking for something. I stood stunned for a moment. She didn't just leave the house all of a sudden, I asked myself, in the same moment realizing the one place I hadn't yet checked. As I took a step backwards, I noticed that the door to the basement was indeed unlatched and slightly ajar, as if it had closed to some degree on its own after someone had gone down. I pushed the door open, realizing that she now had no place to run from my chides, nowhere to hide. As I marched down the steps with phone in hand, 911 up on the screen and my finger on the dial button, I started to shout again. "Like I said, I'm calling the police. You've completely lost it." As I reached the basement floor, I saw her sitting in a metal chair beside the furnace. The crawl space to the original basement was just above her head. I'd never noticed that chair down there before, almost as if she'd placed it there herself. Perhaps she'd been using it as a stool to try and see into that other side of the basement, or perhaps was attempting to listen to something emanating from over there. As our eyes met, she stared directly into my eyes for the first time in months. I stared back at her pale skin, her sunken eyes with dark rings under them from refusal to eat and sleep, her all-around skeletal frame which had so transformed from the exuberant and vibrant curvy body of the woman I once loved. "I'm okay now," she said at the level of a whisper so quiet I could barely hear. She then smiled at me. I'll never forget that smile for the first time since that moment in the hospital when they showed us the first ultrasound of our daughter. "Dear," I started to speak, but before I could get another word out, she lifted the pistol she had found in my desk that was hidden behind her back in her right hand, raised it to her mouth, and pulled the trigger. That is the truth of how my wife died. In those days, we didn't really understand the thing called postpartum depression. The treatments were not as advanced, and the early screenings were in most cases not even done. In honesty, up until that very day that I stood in the tunnel, I had refused to believe that such things could be used as excuses. What's an excuse? What does it excuse exactly? What does it change? I would often ask myself. But there we were now, through a portal dark, into a tunnel far beneath the earth, standing face to face with a monster that it only now dawned on me was actually my wife. The thoughts flashed through my mind. How could it be? Was it something to do with the house, with the demonic presence sowed by those early settlers? Had they caused the entire thing? Had demons possessed my wife and driven her to insanity? But these were fleeting thoughts, as the monster roared again and was fast upon me before I could blink an eye. The last thing I could do was push my daughter away and scream, "Run, don't look back," before I was in its incredibly strong grasp. The rows of razor-sharp teeth sunk into my shoulder and chest as it lifted me off the ground. "Effin' bitch!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. All of the pain I had felt over all these past years, all the hatred for this woman surged again through my being, causing a surge of energy. But at the same time, something else, a counterforce to this, also emerged, and the two interlocked in a deadly struggle. The thought of everything that had brought me here, the thought of these unknowable forces which are beyond all reckoning of the human mind, the thought that the ego is in reality helpless and desperate to feel that it is in control while in reality it is a mere passenger. All of these thoughts swirled. Who am I, it said, no better than any other? I don't feel the pain of those others. I don't know the hell of another's mind. All I can do is embrace the inmost germ of my being, which must be common between all we human beings, and that germ, that nucleus of the self. It must be God. As I felt the teeth sinking deeper into my tendons and crushing and penetrating my bones, I inadvertently pulled out a tangle of hair from the head of my attacker, and as it brushed against my face, I could swear it still smelt of that sweet perfume from the first time I walked past her table at the library, the first time I paused pretending to tie my shoe just to be closer to her, even for a second. And in that moment, without knowing what I was doing or why, I abandoned my ego to the universe. I placed my hand on her head and felt an extreme pain at what she had become, and the monster drew its head back, staring at me. "I forgive you," I screamed. "I still love you. I will always love you. You are me." The monster stared at me for the space of a few moments before it let out a terrible cry of pain. A massive portal yawned behind it, and we both somersaulted into the darkness. When I came to, all I could feel was the immense pain in my chest. My eyes fluttered open. I saw a face hovering above me with a halo of light behind it. "Is that you?" I muttered. But just as quickly a voice came into being. "Is that who, sir?" It was the nanny. Sir, are you okay? I think you're having a heart attack, sir." I opened my eyes and grabbed the hand that she was offering me as she helped me to my feet. She placed my arm around her shoulder. "Let me help you inside, sir. I think we should call an ambulance." "No," I whispered. "No, I think I'm quite all right. I just need a moment to collect my thoughts." She brought me inside and set me at the kitchen chair. "Could you put some coffee on?" I asked. "Sir, I don't know if it's a good idea. I think you drink too much coffee. And now your heart, sir, it's getting mad at you." "Please, I won't ask again. Please do it. It's not what you think. It's what, sir? I found you on the ground like you were having a seizure or something, holding your chest." "It's just a broken heart." They act up like that sometimes, I said serenely as I gazed out the window. Oh, I see, sir. Just then the thought occurred to me. Where's my little darling? She was just with me. She ran off into the darkness. Sir, what does it mean, sir? You just got home from work. I put her down for a nap earlier. She should be... Daddy! I heard her cry as she appeared in the door to the kitchen and leapt into my arms with Dolly in hand. It must have been a terrible dream, I thought to myself, as I hugged and kissed my daughter's head all over the place. Maybe one day I'll look back at this as just an incredibly vivid dream, perhaps some kind of a hallucinatory spell brought on by a bit of minor heart fibrillation. They say the human brain releases DMT at such times, the drug that can cause intense hallucinations. Yes, it'll be just that time I dreamt about the portal to hell Yawned in New Jersey. But as I looked down, something disturbed me. Honey, how did Dolly get so filthy? Oh, sir, the nanny cut in before she could answer. She was playing in the backyard. I didn't realize she snuck Dolly out there. I told her no stuffies outside. They're for inside only. They get so dirty, so hard to clean, we wouldn't want to have to throw them away. Throw away Dolly? My daughter looked up at me immediately, sobbing. No, sweetie, we would never do something like that. I just wanted to know. Frankly, I don't know, forget it. Anyways, did you pull something out for dinner? I asked the nanny. Oh, you men only think about one thing, and that's your stomachs, the nanny reproached me playfully. Of course, sir, you know I don't forget these things. I pulled out some meat. You didn't have any vegetables, though, and that's important for your heart. So I went to the store. I put a few things in the fridge for you, sir. Oh, you didn't have to do that, I started politely, though genuinely grateful for the aid that she provided to me and my daughter to keep some semblance of sanity in this single-parent household. Here, let me reimburse you, I said, feeling around for my wallet. How much did you spend, anyways? Oh, it was nothing, sir. No need. Only $20. 20, huh? I said, finding my back pocket empty and reaching for my front where I felt something bulging. Well, tell you what, I'll give you 40 for your trouble, I said as I pulled my hand out of my pocket holding a tangle of matted black hair. I screamed at the top of my lungs as the pain redoubled in my chest and the sounds of my own screams gradually faded to nothing.